So let's get started. So I'm going to talk about how to craft a conversational API with Dialogflow and Apigee Edge. We're going to have the Google Home Mini talk to Apigee Edge, which is going to talk to a back-end system. Let me introduce my co-presenting partner here.
What should we talk about on today's webcast?
We should talk about how to build a conversational application and how to use Apigee to connect it to an existing enterprise system.
That sounds great.
I'm happy I could help.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Goodbye.
So here's our agenda. First, we're going to talk about how to build a conversational application. What is a conversational application, and why is it interesting? Next, we'll talk about how to connect it to the back end. So we have an existing back-end system, and we're going to talk about how we can adapt this and build an experience API that's specific to this device. So it needs a specific set of protocols. How will we make that happen? And then after that, we'll follow up with question and answer. So what are conversational applications, and why are they interesting? So think of these as chatbots and smart assistants. So an example of this is something you might see on a web page where you're interacting with customer service or doing some predefined task like that. You might see this over a messaging service also. Also think about smart assistants, things like Google Assistant, Siri, Alexa, things that you would interact with. Applications that run within those devices are also conversational applications. There's a great case for these. So the case for conversational applications is pretty strong. 80% of customer interactions can be resolved with a well-designed chatbot. There's $65 billion of potential salary savings from chatbots. And 60% of consumers want easier access to self-service solutions for customer service. And 50% of enterprises will be spending more per annum on bots and chatbots to create traditional, than they would on traditional mobile applications. So interesting case for these things. Primary use cases for this would be things like connecting businesses with their customers. So how can you connect a customer service agent? How would you control IoT devices? And how can you connect businesses to their employees? We're going to run into some challenges when we try to build one of these things. A lot of the systems that we've designed are just not ready for this. So let's look at those. The first one is we need to provide an intuitive user experience using natural language. If you would have talked to a chatbot just a few years ago, you'd find the conversation to be very restrictive. If you followed the script exactly, you might get good results. But if you wander at all, it would get confused, it would get lost, and it would be a very frustrating experience. What we're going to see today is this has changed dramatically. Dialogflow, which we'll talk about, is going to provide a very good and intuitive conversational experience for us. It'll be like talking to a person, and that's our goal. This should be a natural experience that doesn't require the user to adapt how they communicate. We're going to connect that new experience to an existing enterprise system, and that's a challenge. When we built our original enterprise systems, we weren't thinking about speaking to them. We weren't thinking about any kind of conversational interface. So we need to build a whole facade on top of that that facilitates this. And then the third part is we need to provide a great application developer experience. So we need an infrastructure in place, we need an API program in place that makes it easy to create new applications like this for developers. So how do we build an application? What are the parts of this solution? So first thing we're going to talk about today is Dialogflow. Dialogflow empowers developers to build natural and rich conversational experiences. So you can talk with Dialogflow. It will build up a series of conversations in there, keep track of what you're talking about, and what we're going to do in here, we're going to have that send an action over to Apigee Edge. The second part in here is we're going to talk to an existing system to get information. In the case of my demonstration, we've got a gym on the other side, and you can ask the gym when there are classes, you want to sign up for a particular class, things like that. That's a RESTful service, and it's existing, but it doesn't speak the right protocol, so we'll see how to map that. It also requires authentication. You need a username and password to get into this. It uses a service account for that, so we need to work around that. There's no traffic management on this existing API, so if we hook up 1 million of these things and they start talking, we may run into some scalability problems. And finally, there's no caching in place. So we don't have anything to allow this to perform and to be able to handle the kind of traffic that we may get from having new devices. So we'll solve those problems. Finally, we're going to look at Apigee Edge, and Apigee Edge is what we're going to use to adapt this to the new interface. So we'll build some policies within Apogee Edge that allow this device to talk to the back end and allow the back end to respond in the right protocol for the device. So let's look at a demo, and then I'll dive in behind that and we'll see how we built the demo. So back to the assistant.
Hey Google. Talk to Demo Gym.
Sure, here's the test version of Demo Gym.
Hello, I'm the Demo Gym application.
What can you do?
You can ask me which classes are available on a day when a class is available, and you can ask me to sign you up for a class.
What classes are available on Friday?
Yoga, indoor cycling, kickboxing are available on Friday.
When is yoga offered?
Yoga is available on Friday at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 6 p.m.
Sign me up for the 11 a.m. class.
You're signed up for yoga on Friday at 11 a.m.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Goodbye.
So what's behind that demo? How did I make that happen? How did we get it to talk? So let's dive into that and take a look. So the first thing we used in there was Dialogflow. So the challenge here is how do we build that conversational front end so that it can respond to questions and have answers and keep track of what people are doing in there. So that's where Dialogflow comes in. So Dialogflow, go over here. Dialogflow is where we're going to build natural and rich conversational experiences. So this is going to give us a new way to interact and build products. It's going to use conversational AI on there to make sure that we're having a good conversation. So what we build in here can be deployed to a number of different places. We can deploy it to the Google Assistant, to Alexa, to Facebook Messenger, on Slack, other places like that. So that's where we're going to build this rich conversational experience. So if you want to learn this, take a look at dialogflow.com. There's a blog on there. There's some docs on there. I worked through some tutorials to get up to speed on this. So if I wanted to build something in here, I'm going to click over here on Go to Console. From within there, I'm put into this place where I'm going to build an application. So there's a few things in here to talk about. Intents are things that we're going to say. This is what we plan to do. So which classes are available on Friday? I want to know which classes are available on Friday. That's my intention. There's entities. Entities are things that the system knows about, a particular date or the name of a class or something like that. There's a number of built-in system entities, and then there are also custom ones that you can define. Fulfillment is where this would go to be fulfilled. In this case, it's going to be a webhook that calls out to Apogee Edge. And then integrations is where we'll deploy this. So that's going to be the different devices it can run on. I'll dive into each of these individually and we'll take a look at that. So let's start with intents. So you heard me say which classes are available. So within intents, what we're going to do is these are different things that people would say. We'll start with where I started with this was I give it a name. Which classes when is what I chose to call this particular intent. And it has an input context and it has an output context. So the input context is something that would constrain whether it's called or not. A certain condition must be met or Dialogflow has to be in a particular state before this is allowed to be called. In this case, this is one of the first things that's going to be asked. So I haven't put any kind of input context in there that would constrain how this is called because I want it to be called immediately. Next down here, I've got an output state. So after this has been completed, the state of the system is asked which classes when. And this 5 over here is the duration. That's how long this context will stay in memory. There's also some parameters associated with this, like the date. So when I say next Tuesday or on Friday, it will remember that and it's going to keep that in context so that I don't have to keep saying Tuesday every time I want to talk to the device. Next thing to look at in here are these training phrases. So what you do is you type in a few examples of how somebody might interact with this. So what classes are offered tomorrow? Tell me which classes are offered tomorrow. Which classes are available today? What classes are available on Tuesday or Monday or things like that? Which classes are open on Monday? These are all examples of ways that people would say this. Now the great thing here is this does not have to be an exact match. It's helpful if it's close, but it doesn't have to be exact. You'll notice that some of these things are highlighted in yellow. Those are entities that Dialogflow has spotted for me. So this maps to a date. This is going to be sysdate. So when I say tomorrow, it's going to map that to a particular calendar date for me, and it's going to put that into a parameter. So that's what the yellow is in here. Next thing down here is actions and parameters. So when somebody asks this question, I don't have the answer right here in this particular spot. I need to go call a system and get this information. When they ask what classes are available, I need to go do a query and look up a list of classes, find that, translate it into the right format, and then return it to this system. So what I've got in here is find which classes is the name of the action, and then there's some parameters that get sent over to my webhook with that. So I'd like to send the date and the date original. And the difference between those two, the date is a particular calendar date, and date original is how they asked. So if they said like next Tuesday or Friday, that's the words that they used for that. And then if I can't get an answer from an external system, I want to have a fallback in here. And I'm going to say, sorry, I was not able to find which classes are available on that particular date. So these are the parameters. That's the action. These are some responses that would get called. If you know the answer, like if they say thank you, you can say you're welcome right here with just this. If it needs to call out to an external system, we're going to come down here under fulfillment, and we're going to slide this slider that says enable webhook call for this intent. And that means it's going to call your webhook, and it's going to pass these parameters in this action word in a JSON body where you can process it. So that's one intent that's in here. A few others that I have in here, you can do things like find class times. So let's look at another one here. Let's find classes when. So you can ask when a class is a particular class, and then we can sign up for a particular class, book a class. Now notice on this one that there's a constraint on the way in here. There's a context that has to be fulfilled before we get into here. So they have to have asked when the classes are before they can sign up for one. That's just something I put in here to demonstrate that. So this context has to be satisfied before this will even be considered as an answer to something somebody is asking. And there's some examples. Register me for spinning on Tuesday, register me for the yoga class on Tuesday at 9 a.m. So there's a few different ways they can talk to this. These checkboxes down here in actions, they mean that these things are required. So if they forget to put those in there, we want to prompt them. So if they don't tell us what the day is, for example, we're going to say on which day, and we're going to prompt them for that. And then once we get the answer, it will continue. Similar to the last one, we're going to pass a date, a time, and we're going to pass a class name in this case. So those are the intents that I have built into here. Next thing to look at are entities. So the yellow ones in here are built-in ones. The purple in here or the pink in here, that is a particular time. Those are system ones. These brownish ones over here, these are different entities that I've defined. So it knows about regular system things that typically pop up in conversations, but there are some things that it doesn't know about that you want to define for your application. So in my case, I have names of classes like yoga and spinning and cardio boxing and things like that. I need to tell it about those things. So I've come over to entities here, and I've created a new entity called a class name, and that's going to describe that class. So within there, I'm going to list these out. These are different ways somebody might describe a class. Kickboxing, yoga, indoor cycling, those are ways that they might describe them. You can also define synonyms over here. So someone might describe kickboxing as kickboxing or cardio boxing. Indoor cycling might be indoor cycling, spinning, or biking. Those are all different ways they could do that. And if we check this box up here, allow automated expansion, what that's going to do is that's going to use the AI and the speech APIs in Google Cloud, and that's going to make it so it will recognize these other things that are also similar to this that we didn't necessarily list in here. So that's how we enter entities in here. The next thing to look at is fulfillment in here. So how do we get an answer when somebody asks a question? When they ask what classes are available on Friday, how do we get an answer for that? So we're going to call out to a webhook here, and it's going to respond. So within there, we've got a URL. This is Apigee Edge in this case, and that is my API proxy that's going to go and find answers for me. I need to send in an API key in order to get validated by that system and to identify what this agent is. So we're going to have an API key in here, and that's going to be passed in, and that's going to identify this system. The other option in here is to write the code right down here in the inline editor. So you can write cloud functions for Firebase. They can be hosted down there, and you can run it straight in line. I'm interested in the Apogee Edge application here because I'm integrating with an existing system, and I've got a great way to map this request into that. And finally, we've got integrations in here. So this is where we would deploy this once it's all written. So you get it all up and running and working, then you deploy it on a particular device or platform. So in my case, I'm running it on the Google Assistant. That's the first option here. We could run it inside a web page, Facebook Messenger, Slack, a few other options in there. So there's a lot of different choices for where we deploy this and how it works. So what would I do at this point? I've built these intents, I've got some entities, I've set up some fulfillment, I've got a few integrations checked in there. How do I test this out? Well, it turns out there's a nice testing harness right in here. And one nice thing about this is going to show us the details of what that body will be that's sent over to the webhook. So let's find out what classes are available on Friday. So I type that in there. It's going to make a call out, and it's going to get a context back and an answer back. So what we see here is I asked what classes are available on Friday, and it answered with yoga, indoor cycling, kickboxing are available on Friday. And it also set a context, asked which classes when. And it sent this over to Apogee Edge. It processed it, it found an answer, and it returned. The way I figured out what it was going to send was I clicked down here on diagnostic info. And there's the JSON body of what's going to be sent over there. So the interesting parts of this are, we're going to see within here, query result, we're going to see an action. So the action was find which classes, and then the date down here is an actual calendar date. And then this is how I spoke that date. I said on Friday. I didn't say 2018-5/11. And then we can see the response that comes back from the system. It's going to set a context, and it's going to return a few more parameters at the bottom there. Excuse me. So that's our basic information that gets sent back and forth. I use this to try and figure out what I should send over to Apogee Edge and how to process it and things like that. So if we continue our conversation, so we've asked, we know which classes are available. Let's find out when yoga is offered. Now, it remembers that the first time I asked about Friday. So I didn't have to say Friday again. I just said, when is yoga offered? And it says yoga is available on Friday at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., and 6 p.m. It's important in these applications to keep that context so somebody doesn't have to keep asking the same thing over and over again. When we have a conversation with another person, this implied context is in the conversation. So if I say, hey, what's available on Friday? The next time I ask, it's just assumed that I'm still talking about Friday. So that date is stored in the output context from the first call, and it's sent into the parameters of the second call. And again, we can look down here at diagnostic info, and we can get an idea of what's going to be sent over to our webhook for fulfillment. So here we are down here. The action this time is find class times. The specific class name is yoga. And here's the two different ways we specified the date, the calendar date, and then how I spoke that the first time. And we see the answer that comes back from the back-end system in there. So that's our information. That's how we're going to work with Dialogflow. Looks good here. Looks like this is doing exactly what I want. The next step would be figure out how to map that to a back-end system, and we'll dive into how that works. So at this point, you would deploy it on an integration. What I did was I set it up on Google Assistant. I can run it on my phone. I can run it on the Google Home, and it's going to work in either case. So the webhook request and response flow, the way to look at that, I went and looked at the reference documentation on this to figure out how to do this. So go over to dialogflow.com, look at the documentation, click over to reference, scroll down to webhook request and response. So here's the request for the webhook. It tells you what that format is. You've got to pass in a session, a response ID, a query result. I'm sorry, that's in the request. And then there's some details under here of what the object is. And you can click through on that, and it'll give you all the details on that particular thing. On the response side, we're going to see that this text comes back. So we can have a text that's spoken, and we can also have text that's shown on the screen. So for some of these integrations, like if we're using Slack or if we're using the assistant on a phone, for example, we can return a series of cards with possible answers on there. We can return images, URLs, things like that. Or we can just have fulfillment text if we're speaking to a device, for example. So that's our request and response, and that's the reference on how that works. So the next tool to look at is the existing service. So we've got an existing service in there, and we want to call that existing service, and we want to have it give us answers back. So let's explore what that looks like. So here's our existing service. What I've got here on the screen is just a tool that I use to call RESTful services and get answers back. So in this case, I've got a URL up here, and my response comes back over here. So if I call my backend system, and it's going to talk to the classes API, we're going to pass in a particular date, and with that date, we'll look at what classes are available. So we pass in this date, and we get back an answer that looks like this. Now notice that's regular JSON. That's just an array in there that's coming back with 3 different values. That's not suitable to be read. So there's that specific webhook response we have to do, and we map that over in Apigee. So I have 2 things to do. I have to take the webhook request that came in. I've got to remap that into a RESTful call that looks like this with a date on there. And then I've got to take this response that comes back, and I've got to remap that into something that's appropriate for the device. So it can read, it can have those contexts and things like that. So similar, that gives us a list of classes. This is how we request the times for a specific class. So at the end of this URL, we have /classes/yoga. It's going to return the times when yoga is available. If I want to register for a class, I'm going to do a post operation to classes yoga students. I'll pass in my information, and then I'll get back a confirmation number. So those are the 3 different calls that we make to the backend system. So let's look at how to map that. So the next thing to look at is Apigee Edge and how we handle these webhook requests and responses that are coming in and coming out. So I'm going to go into Apigee Edge. This is where I'm going to build my API proxy to handle this. And what I'm building today, I would describe it as an experience API. A lot of times, if you were going to support a new mobile application and you've got an existing enterprise system, you would build an application API just for that. So this is an API just to support that mobile application. And maybe it takes all that data and it's going to shrink down that payload a little bit and make it something that's appropriate for a mobile device. Think of this in the same way, but instead of mobile, this is going to be a voice application. So we're going to take that existing response and map it down to something in here. So let's look at what that looks like. I'm going to click on API proxies over here, and we'll open up the proxy that I built just for this. So we've got Booking Agent in here. Now, if you noticed on my last application, the URLs change. There's going to be something different on the URL depending on what type of thing I'm doing. There's /classes, /classes yoga, /classes yoga students, things like that. So I have a need to change that URL. So what I've done down here is I've defined a backend target. And within there, I've got a little curly brace thing here that says action suffix. That's a variable that I'm going to set in here. I'm going to pull that out of the webhook request that's coming in, and I'm going to map that to the right URL for the backend. And the way I've done that is to put that on the end of the URL here as a variable that will be satisfied in here. Let's click over to develop and see what's in there. So within Apigee Edge, this is where we would build our API proxy. This is where I'm going to do my mapping. So a few things are called on the request. We'll see the response come back. That's what's depicted over here. I've got a number of policies in here that are going to manage this request and response flow for me. And then down here, I've got some actions. I have a pre-flow, which is this stuff up here. This gets called every time, no matter what's on the end of the URL. So these are things that I always want to do. The next 3 are conditional things. So I've defined one of these for every action that's sent in. So if somebody asks what classes are available on Friday, well, we'd find which classes. That would be that one. And I have one of these for every action. And then there's a post flow down here that gets called unconditionally. I don't have anything in there. So for every time somebody invokes this, no matter what they put on the end or no matter what they say to it, this will get invoked. And then one of these will be invoked conditionally based on what's matched in there. So let's dig into that in just a little bit more detail. So the first thing we want to do when this is called is I want to verify an API key. When I set up my webhook in there, I put in an API key. It's passed as a header. That will identify which application is calling in and which one's talking to me. I want to keep track of that so I can collect analytics on it, and I also want to make sure it's an authorized agent. I might have different traffic management policies in here, based on what that application is and what it's doing. So by processing that API key, I get a little bit of security in there, but I also get a lot of rich metadata in there about who the caller is. I've put a spike arrest policy in here. So if I deploy this application and it gets really popular, maybe somebody runs a Super Bowl ad or something, I don't want a million of these things talking to my backend and crashing everything. So this spike arrest is there just to shut that down if too many of these call in too quickly. I'm going to remove some headers. So Dialogflow will send me a very specific request. It's got a bunch of headers in there that are needed in here, but the backend doesn't need those, doesn't understand them, and it's just not appropriate to send them. So what this code in here will do is we're going to set the content type to application JSON, which is what my backend expects. And then we're going to remove a few different headers in there that we just don't need. So it'll take those out of the request and reform the request. The next one is get action. So this is going to grab that action from the webhook request that's sent in. So the webhook request, within the body of that, there's an action and there's a session ID. And those are two pieces of information that I need. We'll save the action. So this is the analytics. This is the statistics collector in Apigee Edge. What this is going to do is keep track of what the actions are. So I want to have a report at some point, and I want to have different stats on who's calling what and how popular these different things are. This next policy in here is a key value lookup. So this is going to be where we're going to get the username and password for the backend system. The backend system in this case requires a service account. It's got a username and password. We'll pull that out of an encrypted key value map, and then this policy will set the password so we can get authenticated with the backend system. So that's going to happen with every call. Let's look at the first one in here where we say find which classes. So in this case, they've specified a date, which classes are available on Friday. We're going to grab the date out of there, and we're going to get the original date. So date is the calendar date, and then date original is the spoken date. The reason I want to grab this is when I put together the response, I want to tell them which classes are available on Friday and not 5/15/2018. I want to speak back to them the same way that they asked the question. So that's the request side of this. Down on the response side, I'm going to get that response back from, let's look over here for what that one looks like. I'm going to get a response back that looks like this. So an array of classes in there. And I need to translate that into an appropriate webhook response for Dialogflow. So that's what's going to happen down here in this JavaScript policy. So classes toString. So what this does is this is just going to iterate over that array and turn it into a string that looks more like a spoken sentence. And we'll set a variable in there called classString. So if there's no classes, set it to that. Otherwise, just make it a comma-separated sentence and then return that. And then finally, we're going to set the response in here. So this is the kind of response that we have to send back to Dialogflow. And within here, we're going to have fulfillment text. That's what it's going to speak. And these curly braces in here, that's the evaluation of a variable. So yoga, kickboxing, etc. are available on Thursday. That's what that's going to say when it goes back. And then we need to set that output context. We need to put Dialogflow into a particular state. So that's what this does. The way we do that is we send back the session ID, context, and then this text right here is whatever that context should be. And a timeout for that, it's going to last for 5 minutes. If somebody stops talking to the device for 5 minutes, it'll reset itself. And then we're going to have a bunch of parameters that we're going to pass back. The date, the original date, the list of classes, things like that. So that's this particular flow. If we go to the next one, we're going to look at what happens as that follow-up. So they may ask, they know which classes are available on Friday, but now they want to know when is a specific class available. So when is yoga available? So we're going to grab out of here the, we're going to parse that action. We'll get that in the preflow. And then we're also going to grab the class name out of here. When is yoga available? And then the second one here is going to grab the date and then the original date. And we'll store those as variables. And then we're going to change the request around. I didn't talk about this too much on the first one, but I'm always getting a post in here, an HTTP post. And my backend system is RESTful. It expects a GET in there. So I'm going to change the verb to a GET. I'm going to rebuild the URL by setting a value for this action suffix. So that was on the end of my target URL. I'm going to put that in there, and that's going to call the backend. And then on this one, I'm going to get back a list of times. So I've got JavaScript in here to map that array of times into a sentence. So it's going to come back like this, and then we've got to create a string that looks like that. And that's what this code is doing in here. We're building up a time string, and then that's going to be returned down here. So down here, we'll see that it gets returned as a string. So that's going to be put into there. Yoga is available Tuesday at 3 p.m. That's what that will look like when it's completely filled out and sent back to the agent. And then we're going to set a context again. This time the context is asked find class timed, and then it's going to last for 5 minutes, and we're going to send back which class they were talking about so we can remember that, a date and a date original. Now, third step in here, they want to register for a class. So what does that look like when they go to register for a class? First thing is we need to know which class. So that's going to come across in the context. It'll be in the parameters under that action section. So we're going to grab the class name out of that body. We're going to get the date, and we're going to get the time. And then we're going to change the request around again. In this case, it is a post, so we're going to leave that alone. But we've got to set the payload to something different. We're going to pass in the information about the user in there, and that's going to be used to register for the class at a particular time. And then on the response side, we're going to get a confirmation number. The back-end system will return a confirmation number for that registration. We want to return that, and then we're going to build up the response in here like we did in the other flows. So down here, you're signed up for yoga Friday at 3 p.m. or whatever they asked for. And we're going to set a context in here of class booked, and then we're going to return that confirmation number in there. So that's our 3 conditional flows in here. The way that I set this up so that these would be called is within the pre-flow here, the key part here is this get action. So this is going to be agent action, and it's going to grab that out of that JSON body when it comes in. And then if we look at down here in the code, these 3 gray things over here, these 3 conditions, these have a conditional expression on them. So if the agent action is register for class, then there's this flow in here. And if the agent action is find class times, that's in here. So that's how I set those up. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Let's see what's going on in here. Let's click on the trace utility over here, and let's start up a trace session and look at what this might look like when somebody calls it. So I'm going to talk into my phone to set up this agent, and we'll look at what it's actually sending across. Talk to Demo Gem.
Sure, here's the test version of Demo Gym.
Hello, I'm the Demo Gym application.
What classes are available on Thursday?
Yoga, indoor cycling, kickboxing are available on Thursday.
When is kickboxing available?
Kickboxing is available on Thursday at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 6 p.m.
Sign me up for the 11 a.m. class.
You're signed up for kickboxing on Thursday at 11 a.m.
Okay, so there's our flow that's going to happen in there, and we'll see these different things come into Apogee Edge. This helps us debug it, figure out what was set in the request, the response. I had this a little bit off when I first did it, and it wasn't responding the right way. I looked in the trace utility in here, and I looked at it, and I realized that I'd had a few things set wrong. So we see these come in. There's our evaluation of the API key, the spike arrest, so on and so forth. Here's our request coming in. There's the actual body that it sends and that sort of thing. We can look at the different stages in here. We can see what's called in there, what matched it, which action was followed. And here's the interesting part. We'll see that this was sent in as a post, V1 booking agent. And then when it goes out, completely different URL. And now it's a get and a completely different URL in there. So we've dynamically built up that URL. We've completely changed the request around, and we're going to send that to the back end. And then when the response comes back, we'll see that we get an array in here of these class names. That's coming back. Flow through the JavaScript, we'll see that the response gets built up. And then we got a completely different response in there that's coming back on this side that's formatted in a very different way. So pop through the different things in here and get an idea of what's flowing back and forth between here and how that's going to map into your enterprise system. So that's a look at our demo today. Next thing to look at, if this was interesting to you, you might be thinking, how do I get started with this? How can I start to build these sort of things? So what I did to get started on this, I hadn't used Dialogflow before. I'd heard about it. I thought it was pretty cool. I thought I'd go check it out. So I went out and I read the documentation and I worked through the tutorial. So there's a tutorial out there where you build a pretty simple application. That got me 90% of the way there. I worked through that and then I referenced the docs a little bit, but I'd say about 2 days to learn this, and it was pretty easy to do. Next thing to do, definitely visit apogee.com. So on Apogee, you're going to find all the information about Apogee Edge. If you're trying to talk to an existing system, I think it's the best way to map that and make that happen. Tons of information out there, references and documentation on how to do that. You can sign up for a free trial, that sort of thing. Community.apogee.com is a great resource for learning more about Apogee. There's tutorials on there, and then there's a bunch of people who can help you out when you're stuck. If you want to learn more about Apogee, sign up for a free trial. There is on the Apogee webpage, you'll see a big red button that lets you sign up for a free trial account. Unlimited access, it'll spin up a cloud account for you. Apogee also offers hands-on enablement. So if you want to learn more about how I did what I did in Apogee Edge, you can sign up for an API Jam. This is a class that we have. It's a hands-on lab. So you can work through some tutorials with our experts and they'll help you out. There's more of these product demo webinars. We do these all the time. Great way to learn about different things and interesting topics on Apogee. So at this point, we're going to pause for some questions. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Okay, so it looks like we got a few questions. Let me go through these and I will answer them. So what happens if someone asks something that the agent can't answer? So great question. This happens all the time. What do you do when somebody goes outside the boundaries of your application? So you can put some fallbacks in there. I don't know how to answer that, or that's not something I know how to do. You can also have some hooks in there like, I'd like to talk to a human, I'd like to talk to a representative, things like that. And that can change the flow. That could call the webhook and take whatever action you need to. That could send it on to somebody else. It could send them over to a web page or whatever you want to do. How do I get up to speed on this? So I built some applications. That's the best way to do it. Get hands-on with it. You can read about it, but you don't really experience it until you're in there. So go into Dialogflow. Look at that diagnostic information. That's going to show what the body is flowing back and forth and things like that. That was very helpful for me. I made a few mistakes in here. I didn't really understand how context worked in here. So for context specifically, there's a really nice blog entry out on the Dialogflow blog page that will give you some details on how context works. After I read that, I understood how it worked. Can you change the device voice? So can we change the voice of this thing and how it speaks to us? Yes, you can. So there's a few different voices that are available, and you can switch between those. It's a nice thing to do for usability because then you know that you're talking to one application or another application. Next question, can this be integrated with Slack? So yes, you can integrate it with Slack. So you've got a few more capabilities in there. What you saw today was strictly a voice-based demo in here where I'm speaking back and forth. When you're in Slack, you can return more custom context in there. You can return URLs, you can return pictures, things like that. So look under the integration sections in Dialogflow, and there's some details in there. Also in the documentation, it talks about features that are specific to some of those platforms. So you can return custom things for that. You can have multiple responses in your webhook response, and they can be custom, like you have one for the assistant and one for Slack, and you can return different things. Next question is, can you integrate Google Calendar with Apogee Edge? So yes, Google Calendar has a great API, and Apogee is your tool for working with APIs. So look at the documentation for Google Calendar. You'll find that there's some very nice APIs in there. You can build a facade in Apogee Edge. Apogee Edge can handle that login for you and things like that. So that's all the questions we have today. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for attending the webinar.